A quick thank you to the T5 peeps. Bob the Dragon, Datamagnet, Cat Crab Lobster, Duck Machine, Try Again 95, Astraya the Dreamer, Mezec, Budic Joel, Germanchemist, Casper Arnholtz, and Chaos to Must. Thank you very much. Story number 1. Convoy, written by Rosie013. As usual, things had gone from bad to worse. The difference, Svet noticed wryly, was that this time no one could blame him for it. The crapbox excuse of a hauler that was his livelihood may have its own faults, but this time it was the new species ship that was holding the convoy back. He hadn't given any of the other ships his attention when the group was assembled, as was his norm, but Svet found he suddenly had an interest in who was trying to get them all killed. That was normally his job. Its designation made no sense. It must have translated poorly. A kind of name was nesting doll for a cargo vessel. The visual feed showed it was an ugly thing. A human ship looked like it had been rescued from a salvage yard and could barely keep up to begin with. No doubt, they had bought it for an exorbitant sum by someone claiming that it was spaceworthy. At least the newcomers had tried to make an effort to paint over the patchwork hull, but its dubious condition was still woefully obvious. Now that one of its 4 primary thrusters appeared to be malfunctioning and spluttering on its sensors, the whole group had been reduced from the already dangerous 90% standard fleet speed his own boat was managing of to a nearly leisurely 70% speed. The pirates who frequented this area would have a field day. Feeling utterly guilty, Svet glanced at the communications console. He had long since muted its alert tone, tired of always being blamed for holding up whatever group that he was traveling with, as well as the empty threats to leave him behind. Now this new race was facing the anger and fear of the other captains. Their species had provided warships to patrol for pirates, and as such their freighters were welcomed in the safety of the trade lane convoys like any other. They would not get left behind no matter how much the other ships wanted to. But that didn't stop them from slowly falling to the more vulnerable rear of the shoal of the ships. His Skinner double-checked the readout over his subordinate's shoulder, just to make sure. Us, another fleet of goods trundling along his space lane. These ones weren't even trying to tear through the momentum alone. They were actually lumbering along at more sedate pace and would be easy to hold up. Suspicious. The grotesquely fat pirate king slumped into his command throne and took a moment to run a bejeweled claw over the oily facial fronds, mulling the situation over. There were no warships in the area. His contacts in the consortium regularly updated him to their movements, or Motter's free of course. They weren't broadcasting the codes that indicated that they were willing to pay his toll either. Maybe they had grown careless. It had been quite a while since he had ordered slaves taken, or even had a ship destroyed outright. The more Skinner thought about it, the more it made sense. His youthful days of ruling by fear were long over. He preferred the toll and tribute method for some time now. He idly stroked his gut's massive girth. Both himself and his prey had grown fat of the arrangement, it seemed. Time to remind everyone who was in charge then. As the orders were given and the skillful but unhurried crew made preparations, his Skinner reviewed the fleet of cargo ships before him. It hadn't taken long to decide who would pay the ultimate price to keep the others in line. The spasming scrap heap at the back was at least likely to yield any cargo of value, although there was at least one that looked to be an acceptable loss if the merchants didn't cower to his opening move. Sidle up to the space lane, torpedo the scrap heap in a fiery display of might, and rob the rest at gunpoint, just like the good old days. His species equivalent of a smile played across his face. It had been too long since his last proper hunt. Svet let out a long groan of annoyance as the nearly inevitable presence of the transponderless ship appeared on the sensors. At a glance, this one had the energy profile of a modified mining vessel. The upgun ship was closing fast, but would not have been able to catch them moving at full fleet speed, and only maybe if they were moving at his maximum of 90%. At a lowly 70, they might as well have been dead in the black for all the hope that they had. Svet's first instinct was to accelerate away as much as he could. Safety of the convoy be damned. But he couldn't bring himself to follow through with that plan. His own hide had been saved many times by the presence of a reluctant convoy staying with his own speed. He couldn't bring himself to abandon the new human species and the same fate. That and the legal consequences of abandoning the convoy. He would never be trusted enough to find work again. Just as Svet was trying to think of other options when a new reading appeared on the screen. Unpowered mass detected in the wake of the convoy. Had the pirates opened fire? There was no telltale energy spike. Wait. Yes, there was, just not from the unidentified vessel. With realization, he refocused his senses on the human ship in dismay. It was beginning to tear itself apart as the crew overclocked its engines to the maximum and began shedding hull. The fools were going to kill themselves in their panic. There was no point in trying to contact him. The communications console was as busy as he'd ever seen it, as the other cargo ships tried to calm the panicking newcomers, and were utterly ignored. Svet could only watch in muted horror as the nesting doll began to open its cargo bays to space, its crew seemingly determined to save themselves by dumping whatever cargo they'd carried into the void. But after a moment, the spill of cargo containers didn't come. Instead, there were cannon? Before he could question his own eyes, the partially revealed warship fired a rolling broadside volley that utterly annihilated the approaching pirate ship in an explosion so bright that the senses were momentarily overwhelmed. After remembering that he still needed to breathe, Svet watched as the camouflaged cruiser restowed its projectile cannons behind its false cargo bay doors. Its energy reading was steady now, as its two nearly uncovered thrusters remained visible and active. All 6 of the vessel's thrusters now performing evenly and at optimal performance as it moved ahead of the convoy. It was the only indication that anything had happened on board the ship at all. The range of emotions that flowed through Svet was immense, as it all caught up to him, surprise that the humans had set a trap for the pirates, anger that he'd been part of the bait, fear as he realized that any human ship could be secretly a warship. The rest of the convoy clearly felt the same shock, as, in direct contrast to just seconds prior, the communications console sat inactive. He made to increase his speed to 90%, as his ship was now the slowest again, now that the ruse was dispelled. Svet also made a mental note not to price gouge the next human customers he got. Probably not a good idea to provoke a species capable of such thought-out, large-scale, underhanded tactics. End of story. Story number 2. Interspecies Reproduction, written by Warpmind. I don't rightly understand humans. We've known them for 17 galactic standard years now, or about 25 years according to the native Sol 3, or Earth as they name it. In the time since they left their own gravity well, they've colonized hundreds of worlds and joined other Sophons on 1,000 more. In fact, to an extent beyond any other known species, they've accommodated members of other species in their own colonies and communities, and formed close connections with most. And the most assorted livestock and pets, as they like to call them. It's estimated that humanity in their own communities might be a politically dominant species, but not the numerically dominant one. Even pre-spaceflight, that excludes unwanted pests and parasites like their insects and rodents. But I digress. I was charged by the Science Council to make a study on human interfertility with other species. It would appear humans have made extensive documentation on which species are capable of producing viable offspring with them. They are, in fact, the first to my knowledge to meticulously study the phenomenon. While children of mixed blood have not been unheard of prior to humanity's arrival on the scene, there's never been extensive studies on the phenomenon, much to my annoyance. So I made it to Earth and consulted with the geneticists, and asked what manner of genome charting that they had started out with for their research. Oddly, most of them looked either confused or embarrassed, and none would give me a straight answer. It took 3 weeks of asking and me digging until I was finally directed to the right database, if one could call it that, on their internet, as a rather sophisticated information network for the time at which it was initially developed. I was puzzled at the entries, scratching my head as I read. Sachzi, cat-like bipeds, roughly 6 to 7 feet tall, confirmed offspring, enthusiastic, bring back teen, this goes for men and women. Ogroy, hamster-like bipeds, about 4 feet tall at most, confirmed offspring, gentle lovers, but guys, I hope you want a big family. Ladies, don't worry about the last part. Kakwaz, reptilian-looking bipeds, 7 foot tall and 5 wide. No confirmed offspring, presumed incompatible. Warning, it's almost impossible to distinguish between the sexes, and the males are not picky and can go on for hours at a time. The list went on. Entries made by random individuals, seemingly with no medical or scientific background at all. I finally cornered a researcher who directed me to the database and asked, I'm not sure if I understand the database's format properly. Where are the genome data, the researcher's credentials, the accredited research laboratories, and the peer reviews? He looked at me, blushing slightly. That's the thing. See, that forum I pointed to you is, it's filled out by, volunteer field operatives who have taken it upon themselves to, as the human saying goes, feck around and find out, in a slightly more literal manner than the saying is usually intended. I stared at him blankly, trying to still piece it together. You mean these people are paid to go out and, proliferate at random? He shook his head. No, not paid. Someone on the forum said it was a labor of love. End of story. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed.